The courtroom fell into silence. The judge's gavel was still vibrating from the last strike. The man standing before him, Mr. Ronald Payne, had a smirk on his face. A simple traffic violation, running a red light, had brought him here. The judge, an older man with sharp eyes, sighed as he reviewed the evidence. A traffic camera had caught Ronald Payne speeding past a red light, nearly causing an accident. The judge shook his head. "Mr. Payne, you've been fined for this offense before. This reckless behavior could have killed someone. You are fined." A small voice suddenly cut through the courtroom. "Daddy does bad things at home too," said a child's voice, clear and innocent. All heads turned toward the sound. A little boy with messy blonde hair and big, round eyes sat on a chair near the front of the courtroom. It was Ronald Payne's 4-year-old son, Charlie. The room held its breath. The judge leaned forward. "What do you mean, young man?" Ronald Payne's face turned pale. "Charlie, shush," he hissed. But Charlie wasn't finished. He swung his little legs back and forth. "Daddy has a big box of money in the garage. And he says if anyone finds out, we gotta run away." The entire courtroom gasped. The judge's eyes darkened, and he leaned back in his chair. "A big box of money, you say?" Ronald grabbed his son's arm. "He's just a kid. He doesn't know what he's saying." Charlie frowned. "But I do, Daddy. You said if the police come, we go to Uncle Jerry's. And you said..." "Enough." Ronald's voice cracked like thunder. But it was too late. The judge's gavel slammed down. "Bailiff, detain Mr. Payne. We have more to investigate." The courtroom erupted in whispers. The traffic case had suddenly turned into something far bigger. What was in that box? Where did the money come from? Ronald struggled as 2 officers grabbed him. "No, you don't understand. He's just a kid." The judge locked eyes with him. "And yet, sometimes, children tell the truth when adults won't." Ronald's breath was heavy. His whole world was crashing. The courtroom was spinning, the whispers growing louder. And then the judge spoke the words that sealed his fate. "Search his house immediately." Everything had gone wrong in the blink of an eye. 3 days earlier, Ronald Payne sat comfortably in his sleek black car, a cigarette dangling from his lips. He tapped the steering wheel impatiently. The red light was taking forever. "Come on," he muttered. He checked his watch. He was late for something important. Not work. No, he hadn't had a real job in years. But there were deals to make, cash to hide, and people to avoid. Charlie sat in the back seat, swinging his feet. "Daddy, can we go to the park later?" "Maybe," Ronald said without meaning it. His mind was elsewhere. The light was still red, but the road was clear. To Ronald, waiting was for fools. He slammed his foot on the gas, and the car shot forward. The moment he crossed the intersection, he saw a camera flash. "Damn it," he cursed. He knew what that meant. A ticket would be coming in the mail soon. Just what he needed. Charlie giggled. "Daddy, you said a bad word." Ronald sighed. "Don't tell your mom." But what Ronald didn't know was that this red light violation would be the beginning of his downfall. Later that night, Ronald sat in his garage, counting the stacks of money inside an old wooden box. Each bill smelled of gasoline and sweat. It wasn't honest money, none of it was. But it was his. 100, 200, 300, damn, I'm good at this. He chuckled to himself. Charlie stood in the doorway. "Daddy, what's that?" Ronald snapped the lid shut. "Nothing, kid. Go back inside." Charlie tilted his head. "Is that where the money comes from?" Ronald swallowed hard. "Listen to me, Charlie," he said, kneeling down to his son's level. "This is a secret, okay? If you tell anyone, we'll have to leave. You don't want that, do you?" Charlie's big eyes blinked. "No." "Good boy." Ronald ruffled his hair. "Now go to bed." Charlie nodded, but something felt weird to him. His daddy never let him touch the money, and the way he talked about running away made his tummy feel funny. 2 days later, a knock came at the door. Ronald answered it, expecting trouble. Instead, a police officer handed him a ticket. "Mr. Payne, you were caught running a red light on Tuesday. You have a court date scheduled." Ronald snatched the paper. Yeah. The officer glanced behind him. Charlie stood there, sucking his thumb. "Nice kid," the officer said. "Drive safer next time." Ronald forced a smile and shut the door. That night, as he sat back in his chair, he chuckled. It's just a traffic ticket. No big deal. He had no idea his own son would be the one to destroy him. Now, back in the courtroom, Ronald Payne felt like his world was crashing. The officers had already left to search his house. Charlie had no idea what he had done, but his innocent words had opened a door that could never be closed. Ronald's hands were sweaty. He turned to the judge. Your Honor, please, he's just a kid. You can't believe everything he says. The judge remained calm. We will let the investigation decide that. Just then, an officer rushed back into the courtroom, holding a clear plastic bag filled with money. Your Honor, we found this hidden in the suspect's garage. Tens of thousands of dollars, unmarked. We also found documents linking him to. The officer stopped, glancing at Charlie. To what? The judge asked. The officer hesitated. Something bigger. Ronald's heart pounded. The judge turned to Charlie. Son, do you know where your daddy got this money? Charlie nodded. Yeah, he takes it from people. And sometimes, he talks to scary men. The judge's face darkened. Ronald's whole body shook. He was done for. Then, another officer ran into the room. Your Honor, we found. Ronald didn't hear the rest. His head was spinning. And then, the officer said something that made the entire courtroom gasp. The judge's face turned pale. Everything was about to change. The courtroom went silent as the officer caught his breath. Then, with a serious voice, he said the words that sent chills through the room. Your Honor, we found weapons hidden in Mr. Payne's house. Unregistered firearms. A lot of them. Gasps filled the room. Even the judge's usually stern face showed shock. Ronald's knees felt weak. Charlie swung his feet on the chair, looking around at the grown-ups whispering to each other. Daddy said they're for protection, he said innocently. The judge's gaze hardened. Protection from what, Mr. Payne? Ronald's lips pressed into a thin line. He knew he was done. The bailiff tightened his grip on Ronald's arm. The officers had already found the money. Now they had found the guns. If they kept digging, they would find out everything. One of the officers approached the judge. Sir, we have reason to believe Mr. Payne has ties to a known criminal organization. A murmur spread through the crowd. Ronald clenched his fists. This is ridiculous, he shouted. You can't believe everything a 4-year-old says. The judge ignored him. Take him into custody. We will be holding him for further questioning. Charlie's little voice rose again. Daddy said if bad people come, we gotta go to Uncle Jerry's. The judge's head snapped up. Uncle Jerry? An officer quickly wrote something down. Sir, we'll need to look into this, Uncle Jerry. If Payne was planning to run, he might be involved too. Ronald yanked against the officers holding him. No, you don't understand. I'm not. But the judge slammed his gavel. Take him away. The officers dragged Ronald out of the courtroom. His shouts echoed down the hallway, but no one cared anymore. The truth was coming out, piece by piece, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Charlie just watched, confused. Where's Daddy going? The judge softened his voice. He's going somewhere we can ask him some important questions, son. Charlie nodded. Oh, are you going to ask him about the scary men too? The judge froze. What scary men? Charlie thought for a second. The ones who come to the house late at night. They give Daddy bags. And then Daddy gives them the big envelopes. The judge looked at the officers. Get a team to Payne's house immediately. And take young Charlie somewhere safe. The officers nodded, and one of them gently took Charlie's hand. Come on, buddy. Let's get you some ice cream. Charlie beamed. Can I have 2 scoops? The officer chuckled. You can have as many as you want, kid. The courtroom slowly emptied, but one thing was clear. This was no longer just about a red light. This was something much, much bigger. Earlier that week, before his world started falling apart, Ronald Payne sat in a dimly lit bar, tapping his fingers on the counter. A man in a dark jacket slid onto the stool next to him. You're late, the man said, his voice low. Ronald took a sip of his drink. Relax. You got what I need. The man slid a small piece of paper across the counter. The money better be in the usual spot. Ronald smirked. It's there. Don't worry. The man stood up, his face hidden in the shadows. If it's not, you know what happens. Ronald's smirk faded as he watched the man disappear out the door. He finished his drink and stood up, slipping the paper into his pocket. It was time to get back home, before Charlie started asking too many questions. Later that night, Ronald sat in his garage, stacking money into the wooden box. His hands were steady, but his mind was racing. The deal had gone through. The money was clean, for now. But the more he did this, the riskier it got. He lit a cigarette and leaned back in his chair. And then he heard a noise. A tiny shuffle. He turned his head sharply. Charlie stood in the doorway, rubbing his eyes. Daddy, I had a bad dream. Ronald exhaled, forcing a smile. It's okay, buddy. Go back to bed. Charlie pointed at the box. What's that? Ronald's heart skipped a beat. Nothing. Just some papers for work. Charlie yawned. Can I help? Ronald chuckled nervously. Not tonight, kid. Go to bed. Charlie hesitated, then nodded. Okay. Night, Daddy. Night, buddy. As soon as Charlie was gone, Ronald locked the box and shoved it into the darkest corner of the garage. This was getting dangerous. If Charlie ever talked. No, he wouldn't. He was just a kid. What Ronald didn't know was that his son saw more than he realized. And in just a few days, that tiny voice would bring everything crashing down. Back in the present, officers stormed into Ronald Payne's house. They found the money. They found the guns. And then, in the back of a locked closet, they found something even worse. One of the officers stepped back, his face pale. Call the judge. Now, the discovery would change everything. And Ronald Payne's nightmare was just beginning. The officer's flashlight trembled slightly as he shined it on the hidden compartment inside Ronald Payne's closet. The other officers gathered around, peering into the darkness. What the hell is this? One of them muttered. Inside the compartment was a small, steel safe, dented and scratched, as if someone had tried to pry it open before. The officers exchanged glances. They already found illegal money, unregistered firearms, and now this? Get it open, the lead officer ordered. Another officer crouched down, pulling out a set of lock-picking tools. Within minutes, there was a sharp click. The safe door swung open. Silence fell over the room. Inside the safe were stacks of documents, photographs, and, most disturbingly, a black leather notebook, its pages filled with names, numbers, and disturbing notes. One of the officers flipped through the book. His face darkened. We need to get this to the judge immediately. But it wasn't just the book that caught their attention. Tucked beneath the papers was a collection of IDs. Dozens of them. Different names, different faces. Some looked brand new. Others were worn and tattered. This guy was running more than just dirty money, an officer muttered. Fraud, stolen identities, possible hit lists. This is bad. Then another officer picked up one of the photographs. His face went pale. Wait a second. I know this guy. He turned the photograph around for the others to see. It was a grainy, black and white image of a man in a suit, shaking hands with Ronald Payne. But the problem wasn't just the man in the photo. It was who he was. This is a federal agent, the officer whispered. The entire room froze. Ronald Payne wasn't just dealing with criminals. He had connections with people in law enforcement. And if a federal agent was involved, that meant things just got a lot more dangerous. Back at the courthouse, the judge sat in his chambers, rubbing his temples. The case that had started as a simple traffic violation had now become something much bigger. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Come in. An officer entered, holding the black leather notebook. His face was serious. Your Honor, you need to see this. The judge took the notebook and flipped it open. As he scanned the pages, his expression darkened. Where did you find this? He asked. In Payne's house. In a locked safe. We also found multiple fake IDs, and, the officer hesitated, then continued, photographic evidence that Payne was working with corrupt officials. The judge's grip on the notebook tightened. This just became a federal matter. At that moment, another officer burst into the room. Sir, Payne is demanding a lawyer. He says he won't talk. The judge let out a slow breath. He won't have a choice. He closed the notebook and stood up. Get him back in here. Ronald Payne sat in an interrogation room, his hands cuffed to the metal table. His mouth was dry. His mind was racing. He had known he was in trouble, but not this much trouble. A moment later, the door swung open. The judge entered, followed by two officers. One of them placed the black notebook on the table in front of Ronald. Ronald's stomach dropped. The judge sat down across from him. Would you like to explain this? Ronald forced a smirk. I don't know what that is. The judge didn't blink. So you don't recognize your own handwriting? Silence. One of the officers flipped open the book. This contains details of illegal money transfers, weapons trades, and names of people who have mysteriously disappeared. He tapped a page. This man here went missing 2 years ago. Never found. Ronald clenched his jaw. You can't prove anything. The judge leaned forward. Actually, we can. The officer slid a photograph across the table. It was the image of Ronald shaking hands with the federal agent. Ronald's smirk vanished. The judge's voice was calm, but firm. We know you're working with corrupt officials. We also know that some of the people in this book have either vanished or turned up dead. Ronald's breathing became shallow. This is ridiculous. The judge ignored him. Right now, you're facing multiple charges: money laundering, illegal possession of firearms, identity fraud, and possibly even conspiracy to commit murder. Ronald's eyes darted to the door. His mind was spinning, searching for a way out. The judge continued. But here's the thing, Mr. Payne. You're not the top of the chain, are you? Ronald's fingers curled into fists. The judge leaned back. We want the people above you. Give us names, and maybe we'll consider cutting you a deal. Ronald's mind raced. If he talked, he was a dead man. If he stayed quiet, he'd spend the rest of his life behind bars. He swallowed hard. I need to think. The judge stood. Take all the time you want. But if you don't cooperate, I guarantee you won't like what happens next. As the judge left the room, Ronald slumped in his chair. He was trapped. And worse, someone, somewhere, was watching. Because if the police had found this, then the people he worked for already knew. And they wouldn't let him talk. Meanwhile, back at the Payne residence, officers continued searching the house. Then, one officer's voice rang out. Hey, I found something else. Another hidden compartment. Another safe. But this time, when they opened it, they didn't find money or weapons. They found something much, much worse. One officer turned away, covering his mouth in horror. Call the judge. Now. The discovery was enough to change the case completely. And Ronald Payne's nightmare had just begun. The officer's hands shook as he picked up the radio. His voice was urgent. Judge, we've found something disturbing. Silence crackled on the line for a moment. Then, the judge's voice came through, steady but firm. What is it? The officer hesitated, then took a deep breath. We found photographs, sir. Dozens of them. And they're not just of strangers. Some of these pictures are of people who have gone missing. The radio went silent again. Then the judge's voice came back, sharp as a knife. I'm on my way. The officers in the house exchanged uneasy glances. They had signed up for this job expecting to deal with criminals, but this was something darker. One of the younger officers flipped through the stack of photos, his face turning pale. This guy was keeping trophies, he murmured. The lead officer turned to another investigator. We need forensic teams in here. Now, as they worked, the reality of the situation sank in. Ronald Payne wasn't just a con man. He wasn't just running money and weapons. He was connected to something much worse. Back at the interrogation room, Ronald sat in silence, staring at the table. He had stopped pretending to be cocky. He knew things were getting out of hand. Then, the door swung open, and the judge entered, followed by two detectives. One of them carried a folder. He dropped it on the table with a heavy thud. Ronald's stomach turned. The judge sat down. He didn't say a word as the detective opened the folder and spread the photos across the table. Faces. Some smiling. Some looking nervous. Some clearly unaware they were even being photographed. Ronald clenched his jaw. I don't know what this is. The judge's eyes darkened. Cut the act, Mr. Payne. The detective leaned in. These are people who have disappeared. And now, thanks to your little collection, we know you had contact with them before they vanished. Ronald forced himself to breathe evenly. Coincidence. The judge exhaled sharply. Enough, Mr. Payne. He tapped on one of the photographs. This woman, Emily Carter, went missing 6 months ago, last seen at a gas station. He tapped another. This man, Daniel Reeves, disappeared 2 years ago after taking out a large loan. The list goes on. The detective folded his arms. What did you do to them? Ronald shook his head. You don't understand. The judge slammed his palm on the table. No, you don't understand. This has gone beyond illegal money and fake IDs. We are now talking about disappearances. And if we dig deeper and find bodies. His voice lowered. You're looking at murder charges. Ronald's breathing quickened. He stopped himself. The judge leaned in. I'm giving you one last chance, Mr. Payne. You tell us everything. Who you work for. What this is about. Or you will rot in a cell for the rest of your life. Ronald was sweating now. He could feel the walls closing in. If he talked, the people above him would come for him. If he stayed quiet, the law would bury him. Either way, he was dead. But before he could decide, the door burst open. An officer rushed in, looking breathless. Sir, we just got a report from the search team. Someone broke into Payne's house. The room went cold. The judge's face tightened. What do you mean, broke in? The officer caught his breath. While we were investigating, someone forced their way into the house. They destroyed the safe where we found the photos. They took anything we hadn't processed yet. The detectives cursed under their breath. Ronald's heart pounded. They came for the evidence. The officer continued. One more thing, sir. They left a message. The judge's eyes narrowed. What kind of message? The officer hesitated. Then he pulled a plastic evidence bag from his pocket. Inside was a single playing card. The ace of spades. On the back, written in black ink, were 3 chilling words. He talks, he dies. The room fell into complete silence. Ronald's body went rigid. They knew. The people he worked for, they knew he was caught. And they were already cleaning up the mess. The judge took a slow breath. Well, Mr. Payne, looks like you're running out of options. Ronald swallowed hard. His hands were shaking now. You have to protect me, he whispered. The judge tilted his head. That depends. Are you ready to talk? Ronald squeezed his eyes shut. Then, finally, he exhaled. Okay, he whispered. I'll tell you everything. But outside the station, a black car sat parked down the street, its engine running. Inside, a man in a dark suit lit a cigarette. His phone buzzed. They've got Payne, a voice on the other end said. The man took a slow drag of his cigarette, then exhaled. Not for long. The call ended. The car pulled away, and Ronald Payne had no idea that even behind bars, he was far from safe. The station was quiet, but tension filled the air like a storm waiting to break. Ronald Payne sat in the dimly lit interrogation room, his fingers tapping nervously against the cold metal table. The black notebook lay open in front of him, the names and numbers staring back at him like ghosts. The judge, along with 2 detectives, stood across from him, waiting. Talk. One of the detectives ordered. Start from the beginning. Ronald took a shaky breath. He could feel the weight of the playing card still in his mind. He talks, he dies. But if he stayed silent, the law would bury him alive. I wasn't always in this mess, he began, voice hoarse. It started small, laundering money, fake IDs, keeping things off the books for people who needed it. He let out a dry chuckle. Easy money. No one got hurt. The judge folded his arms. Then what changed? Ronald swallowed. I got noticed. Bigger players came knocking. They had different needs. They needed a man who could clean things up, make things disappear, people included. The room went cold. One of the detectives leaned forward. Are you saying you were involved in making people disappear? Ronald shook his head quickly. No, I never did anything. But I knew things. I moved money. I arranged meetings. I was the guy behind the scenes. He looked down at his hands. I thought that made me safe. The detective's jaw tightened. Who are they? Ronald exhaled through his nose. I don't know all of them. But there's one name. He hesitated, glancing toward the door, as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. They call him the broker. The judge frowned. The broker? Ronald nodded. I don't know his real name. No one does. He doesn't just handle money. He handles people. He has cops, businessmen, and even politicians in his pocket. If you cross him, you disappear. One of the detectives flipped through the black notebook. Is he in here? Ronald shook his head. No. He's smarter than that. No paper trails, no digital footprints. The only thing I ever got was a message, a time, and a place. The judge narrowed his eyes. And where was the last place you met him? Ronald hesitated. Then, just as he was about to speak, bang! A loud crash echoed through the station. The detectives spun toward the door, hands on their holsters. The judge's face went pale. An officer burst into the room, breathless. Sir, we have a situation. The judge turned sharply. What happened? The officer's voice was tight with fear. There's been a breach. Someone cut the power to the station, and security just spotted 2 unidentified men trying to get inside. The room fell into dead silence. The detective cursed under his breath. They're here for Payne. Ronald's face drained of color. No. He shot to his feet, his cuffs clinking against the chair. You have to get me out of here. You don't understand. If they get in, I'm dead. The judge was already in motion. Lock down the station. Secure all exits. But before the officer could respond, boom, a loud explosion rocked the building. The lights flickered. A siren wailed. Then gunfire erupted. Ronald's breath came in short, panicked gasps. His heart pounded against his ribs. They're already inside, the detective whispered. The judge turned to the officers. Get Payne somewhere safe, now. 2 officers grabbed Ronald by the arms and hauled him toward the emergency exit. Ronald struggled, his breath coming in ragged gasps. They'll kill me. They'll kill all of us. Bullets shattered glass somewhere in the station. Officers shouted. Chaos erupted in the hallways. As Ronald was dragged down a dark corridor, a thought slammed into his mind like a freight train. Charlie. His son was out there. Alone. Unprotected. And if these men were tying up loose ends? His blood ran cold. Wait, he shouted, digging his heels into the floor. My son. They might go after my son. One of the officers swore. Get him in the car now. They burst through a side door into the cold night air. A black van screeched to a stop in front of them. Move. Move. An officer yelled, shoving Ronald inside. As the van sped off, sirens blared behind them. The station was under attack. And somewhere in the darkness, unseen eyes were watching. The broker had sent his message. This wasn't over. Not even close. The black van tore through the darkened streets, its tires screeching as it rounded a corner. Inside, Ronald Payne sat sandwiched between two officers, his breath ragged, his wrists still cuffed. The lead officer in the passenger seat shouted into his radio. We have Payne secured, but the station is compromised. We need backup at his son's location, now. Ronald's stomach twisted. Charlie. His little boy. What if they're already there? His voice cracked as he struggled against his restraints. You don't know who you're dealing with. They don't leave witnesses. The officer beside him tightened his grip. Calm down, Payne. Ronald shook his head. You don't understand. Another officer turned around from the front seat. Where's your kid? Ronald's breath came in short bursts. My ex-wife's house. But they won't stop there. He swallowed hard. They'll go for anyone I care about. My kid. His mother. Anyone who knows me. The officer in the passenger seat turned back, his expression grim. Then let's pray we're not too late. The van roared down the empty street, sirens blaring in the distance. But even as they sped forward, Ronald couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. They weren't just running. They were being hunted. Meanwhile, at Charlie's house, the small, single-story home sat in eerie silence. A dim porch light flickered as shadows moved along the street. Inside, Charlie sat on the couch, swinging his little legs as he sipped on his juice box. His mother, Lisa, was in the kitchen, washing dishes. The night was quiet. Too quiet. Then, a soft click came from the back door. Lisa froze, the soapy plate slipping from her fingers into the sink. She turned her head slowly. Another click. Someone was outside. Her breath caught in her throat. She grabbed a towel, wiping her hands quickly before reaching for her phone. She typed a quick message. Something's wrong. Call me. But before she could hit send, crash. The back door burst open. A masked figure lunged into the house. Lisa screamed. Charlie's juice box tumbled to the floor as his eyes went wide with fear. Then, a second figure entered. Both men were dressed in black, their faces obscured by ski masks. Where's the kid? One of them growled. Lisa grabbed a knife from the counter. Stay away from him. The taller man chuckled darkly. Bad choice. He lunged. Lisa slashed wildly, but he knocked the knife from her hands with terrifying ease. She stumbled back, heart pounding. Charlie clutched the couch, too scared to move. The second man stepped toward him. Come here, kid. Charlie whimpered. Lisa screamed, throwing herself between them. Run, Charlie. Charlie bolted. His little legs carried him down the hallway as fast as they could. The taller man grabbed Lisa by the throat, shoving her against the wall. Where is he? She gasped, clawing at his hand. You won't touch him. The shorter man cursed. Forget her. The kid's getting away. They tore down the hallway. Charlie ducked into his bedroom, slamming the door behind him. His tiny hands fumbled with the lock. Click. He backed away, his heart pounding in his chest. Outside, heavy footsteps pounded toward the door. Bang. Bang. The door rattled violently. Charlie clutched his teddy bear, tears spilling down his face. Daddy, he whispered. Then, sirens. Flashing blue and red lights flooded the house. The men cursed. Time's up, one of them snarled. Let's go. They sprinted for the back door, vanishing into the night just as police cars screeched to a stop outside. Lisa gasped for breath, collapsing to the floor as officers stormed in. My son. Charlie, he's in the bedroom. Within seconds, an officer kicked open Charlie's door. The boy was curled up in the corner, shaking. It's okay, buddy, the officer said softly. You're safe now. But Charlie only had one question. Where's my daddy? Back in the van. Ronald's phone rang. The officer next to him answered. Go. Lisa's shaky voice came through the line. They were here. They were in my house. Ronald's heart nearly stopped. Is Charlie okay? He demanded. He's safe, Lisa breathed. But they almost took him, Ronald. They were after our son. Ronald squeezed his eyes shut. His hands clenched into fists. This wasn't just about him anymore. The broker wasn't just sending a message. He was making it personal. Ronald took a deep breath and turned to the judge. His voice was different now, steady, cold. Get me somewhere safe, he said. Then I tell you everything. The judge studied him for a moment. Then he nodded. Drive. The van sped into the night. But they weren't the only ones moving. From a rooftop a few blocks away, a sniper lowered his rifle. His earpiece crackled. Did you have the shot? A voice asked. The sniper exhaled. Negative. Too many moving targets. A pause. Then the voice on the other end spoke again. Then we moved to the next phase. The sniper smirked. Copy that. The call ended. And somewhere, far away, the broker was already one step ahead. The safe house was a small, rundown motel on the outskirts of town, the kind of place no one looked twice at. It smelled of stale cigarettes and dust, and the neon sign outside flickered weakly. Ronald Payne sat on the bed, staring at the peeling wallpaper. His mind was racing. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this was different. They had come for Charlie, and that meant there was no going back. The judge and the two detectives stood in the room, waiting. An armed officer was posted outside, scanning the parking lot for any movement. The judge crossed his arms. All right, Mr. Payne. You wanted protection. You have it. Now, start talking. Ronald exhaled slowly. His hands were still shaking, but his voice was steady. The broker doesn't work like normal criminals. He doesn't leave trails, he doesn't make mistakes, and if you come for him, he knows before you do. One of the detectives scoffed. Sounds like a ghost story. Ronald shook his head. It's not a story. He controls everything from the shadows. Banks, businesses, politicians, cops. You think the law means something to a man like him. He let out a bitter laugh. By the time you even realize he's involved, you're already dead. The judge leaned forward. Then why are you still alive? Ronald swallowed hard. Because I never crossed him. Until now. The detectives exchanged glances. One of them, a tall man with sharp eyes, asked the real question. What does he want from you? Ronald looked at his hands. I was useful. I cleaned money. I handled transactions. I made things disappear. But I was never high enough to know everything. I was just a middleman. He clenched his jaw. But a middleman still knows things. The judge narrowed his eyes. Then tell us what we need to bring him down. Ronald hesitated. He knew what that meant. If he talked, he wouldn't just be a loose end. He'd be a target for the rest of his life. But then he thought of Charlie. His little boy, clutching his teddy bear, crying. No more running. He took a deep breath. There's a ledger. The detectives perked up. A ledger? Ronald nodded. It's the only physical record of his deals. He doesn't trust digital files. Everything goes through that book. Names, payments, locations, everything. The judge's eyes darkened. And where is it? Ronald exhaled sharply. It moves. Every few months. But the last time I checked, it was in a storage unit on the south side of town. He keeps it in a locked safe. Only a handful of people even know it exists. The judge turned to the detectives. We need a team on that location now. One of the detectives pulled out his phone and started making calls. Ronald shifted in his seat. You don't get it, he muttered. The judge frowned. Get what? Ronald's voice dropped to a whisper. He knows we're coming. The room fell into silence. Then, boom. The window exploded inward as a bullet tore through the air. Down, an officer shouted, tackling the judge to the ground. Ronald dove for cover as another round shattered the motel's lamp. The detectives pulled their weapons, dragging Ronald toward the back exit. They found us, one of them yelled. The officer at the door kicked it open, scanning the parking lot. Go, go. Ronald ran. His breath came in ragged gasps as he sprinted through the alley behind the motel. The judge and the officers followed, moving fast. Behind them, another shot rang out. The neon motel sign shattered into sparks. A black SUV screeched into view at the end of the alley, cutting off their escape. Back, the detective shouted. But another SUV pulled up behind them. They were trapped. Doors swung open. 4 men stepped out, faces cold, weapons drawn. One of them, a tall man in a gray suit, adjusted his tie. Mr. Payne, he said smoothly. "You've been very disappointing." Ronald's blood ran cold. He knew that voice. This wasn't just another hitman. This was the broker's right-hand man. The man smiled faintly. "You should have kept your mouth shut." Then he raised his gun. Ronald braced for the shot. Bang! But it wasn't aimed at him. One of the detectives crumpled to the ground, blood pooling beneath him. The judge's face twisted in horror. No! Chaos erupted. The officers returned fire. The alley flashed with gunfire as the night exploded into violence. Ronald ducked behind a dumpster, his heart pounding. This wasn't a warning anymore. This was war. And the broker wasn't playing games anymore. Gunfire filled the alley, flashing in bursts of orange light. Bullets ricocheted off the brick walls, sending sparks flying. Ronald Payne crouched behind the dumpster, his heart slamming against his ribs. The detective who had been shot lay motionless in a growing pool of blood. Another officer dragged him behind cover, shouting for backup. "Hold them off," the judge yelled, firing his gun. Ronald knew how this worked. The broker didn't send men to scare people. If they were here, it meant only one thing. He was supposed to die tonight. The men in suits moved with terrifying precision, covering each other as they advanced. One of them reloaded, then called out, "Payne, this doesn't have to be difficult. Give yourself up, and we make it quick." Ronald's breath came in short gasps. His mind raced. He couldn't die here. Not when Charlie was still in danger. An officer next to him fired a shot, hitting one of the attackers in the shoulder. The man staggered but didn't go down. Instead, he grit his teeth and kept moving. Ronald cursed under his breath. These weren't just hired guns. They were professionals. The judge turned to him. "We need to move. Now." "But they have us surrounded," a detective shouted. Ronald scanned the alley. There had to be a way out, some weakness in their formation. Then he saw it. A fire escape. Rusty, hanging just above the dumpster. "Up there," he pointed. The judge followed his gaze. "Go." "Now." Ronald jumped, grabbing the bottom rung. His fingers slipped, but he gritted his teeth and pulled himself up. The officers covered him, laying down suppressing fire. One by one, they scrambled up the ladder. Just as the last officer climbed on, the gunman realized what was happening. "Stop them," one of them shouted. Bullets slammed into the metal, shaking the ladder. Ronald scrambled onto the rooftop, panting. The judge hauled himself up after him. "We need an extraction," he barked into his radio. A voice crackled back. "ETA 5 minutes. "We don't have 5 minutes. Below, the gunman spread out, looking for another way up. Ronald scanned the rooftops. There, 2 buildings down, an old scaffolding led to the street. "We jump," he said. The officers hesitated. "Are you insane?" Ronald didn't wait. He sprinted and leaped across the gap. His foot barely caught the edge, and for a second, he thought he was going to fall. Then strong hands grabbed him, pulling him up. The detective who had made it across first grinned. "Not bad for a dead man." The judge landed next. The remaining officers followed, and together they ran toward the scaffolding. Behind them, the gunman reached the rooftop. One of them raised a radio. "They're moving south. Intercept them at the next street." Ronald heard it. His stomach twisted. They weren't escaping. They were running straight into another trap. Meanwhile, across town, Charlie sat in the back of a police cruiser, hugging his teddy bear. His mother, Lisa, sat next to him, gripping his hand tightly. An officer drove, his hands tense on the wheel. "We're taking you both somewhere safe," he assured them. Lisa's mind was racing. Someone had broken into her house. They had tried to take her son. She had so many questions. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just about Ronald anymore. Whoever these people were, they wanted Charlie. Lisa turned to the officer. "Where exactly are we going?" The officer didn't answer immediately. He glanced at the rearview mirror. Lisa's pulse quickened. "Officer." Then she saw it. A pair of headlights in the distance. Moving fast. Her grip on Charlie's hand tightened. The officer pressed his earpiece. "We've got a tail." A second later, the pursuing car's lights blacked out. Then it accelerated. Lisa barely had time to scream before the car behind them slammed into the cruiser. The impact sent them spinning. Charlie's teddy bear flew from his hands. Lisa reached for him, heart hammering. The officer fought for control, but the police car skidded wildly. Then, another impact. The world flipped upside down. Glass shattered. Metal groaned. The car tumbled, rolling off the road and into a ditch. Silence. Smoke filled the air. Lisa groaned, her vision swimming. Pain throbbed through her body. Then she heard it. Footsteps. crunching through the glass. She turned her head. Through the broken windshield, shadowy figures approached. Lisa's breath caught. They weren't here for her. They were here for Charlie. She tried to move, tried to reach for him. A gun pressed against her temple. Don't. Her blood ran cold. A man leaned down, his masked face expressionless. He reached into the wreckage and pulled Charlie out. The little boy whimpered, dazed, clutching at empty air. Lisa screamed. No. She tried to fight, but hands pinned her down. Charlie's sleepy voice whispered, Mommy? The man held him close, speaking into a radio. We have the kid. Lisa's world shattered. Then, darkness. She blacked out. Back on the rooftops, Ronald Payne suddenly stopped running. The others turned. What are you doing? The judge demanded. But Ronald wasn't listening. Something was wrong. He felt it. Then his phone buzzed. A single message. We have the boy. Ronald's body went ice cold. His stomach turned. Then, another message. A photo. Charlie, unconscious, in the arms of a masked man. Ronald's breath hitched. His hands shook as he clutched the phone. The broker had him. His son. His son. The judge saw his face. What's wrong? Ronald turned, eyes blazing. They took Charlie. A deadly silence fell over the group. Then, from the shadows, a voice echoed from a speaker. A phone call, broadcasted from a hidden device. The broker's voice was smooth. You talk, he dies. Ronald's hands curled into fists. The broker chuckled softly. Welcome to the real game, Payne. Then the line went dead. And Ronald knew. He had just lost the only thing that mattered. Ronald's heart pounded in his chest. He stood frozen on the rooftop, the phone in his hand feeling like a weight he couldn't bear. The voice on the other end of the line had been cold, calm, and chillingly final. You talk, he dies. He looked up at the judge, whose face was etched with concern. What happened? What did they say? Ronald's voice was a rasp. They've got Charlie. His hands trembled as he dropped the phone, letting it fall to the ground. They took him. The judge's eyes narrowed. We need to get him back. Ronald's eyes burned with rage. You don't understand. This isn't about money or deals anymore. It's personal. The broker will kill him if I don't do what he wants. One of the detectives cursed under his breath. We need a plan. Now. Ronald looked at him, his voice low but filled with venom. The only plan I have is to get to him before it's too late. How? You don't even know where they're keeping him. Ronald clenched his fists. He knew the broker. This wasn't about a ransom or a quick trade. No, this was a game. And the broker always won his games. But Ronald wasn't going to let his son die without a fight. He would find Charlie. He had to. Do you have any leads? The judge asked, trying to pull Ronald out of his spiral of anger. Ronald's mind raced. He thought about the ledger, the storage unit, the locations they had discussed in the past. The broker always used untraceable, hidden places. But then it hit him. He remembered something. The broker always spoke about a final location. A place where he kept his most important assets. That was it. I know where they're taking him, Ronald said, his voice suddenly steady. I know where the broker hides his people. The judge raised an eyebrow. Where? An old warehouse. It's on the outskirts of the city. It used to be a shipping center, a front for his operations. The detective pulled out a map. I've heard about that place, he said, tracing a route with his finger. But we'll need backup. We can't just walk in there. Ronald's eyes darkened. Then we run in. We don't wait for backup. Meanwhile, at the warehouse, inside the cold, dimly lit building, Charlie was strapped to a chair, his tiny hands bound tightly with rope. His teddy bear lay on the ground beside him, discarded. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. He didn't understand why the men had taken him, or why they were being so mean. Mommy? Daddy? He whispered, but no one answered. From the shadows, a figure stepped forward, a tall man in a black suit. His face was hidden behind a mask. Charlie's heart raced. Where's my mommy? Where's my daddy? The man crouched down in front of him, tilting his head as though studying him. Your daddy made a big mistake, he said quietly, his voice low and smooth. Please, I want to go home, Charlie whimpered. The man's expression remained unreadable. He stood up and turned to a nearby monitor. A screen flickered to life, showing a grainy image of Ronald Payne's face. We have him, the man said, speaking into a hidden microphone. He's coming. It's only a matter of time. Back on the rooftops, Ronald was already moving. The adrenaline coursing through him, every fiber of his being focused on one thing, getting to Charlie. The judge and the detectives followed close behind, trying to keep up with his frantic pace. "You're moving too fast," the detective called out. "I don't care," Ronald snapped. "They have my son. They don't get to play with him anymore." They reached the edge of the city, the warehouse looming in the distance. A place long abandoned, but still the perfect hiding spot for a criminal like the broker. Ronald stopped. They were close now. So close. "It's that one." He pointed at the large building ahead. It looked decrepit, like it hadn't been touched in years. The detective checked his gun, eyes scanning the area. "We move fast and hard. We don't give them a chance to react." Ronald's eyes were cold. "No mistakes. We go in now." They approached the warehouse, sticking to the shadows, avoiding the flickering lights that illuminated the main entrance. Every sound seemed to echo in the silence of the night. Then, a sudden noise. A crackling sound from an earpiece. "Sir," came a voice. "We have a problem." Ronald's stomach tightened. "What is it?" "We're not alone. They knew you were coming. The perimeter's been compromised. We need to move." "Too late," Ronald muttered. "They've got Charlie. Let's finish this." They reached the back entrance. Ronald took a deep breath, steeling himself. Every step he took toward the building was one step closer to his son, and closer to whatever nightmare awaited inside. The detective glanced at him. "Are you ready?" Ronald didn't answer. He just nodded. And with that, they kicked open the back door. The warehouse was dark, but the flickering lights in the distance gave them just enough to see. "Move," the judge barked. The group split into pairs, cautiously moving through the shadows, guns drawn, eyes scanning every corner. They didn't know what they would find in here. But one thing was for sure, they weren't leaving without Charlie. As they made their way through the maze of crates and metal structures, a low sound echoed through the warehouse. A door creaked open somewhere ahead. Ronald's heart skipped. He knew it. They weren't alone. Then, a voice broke the silence. "Looking for someone?" Ronald froze. From the shadows, a figure stepped forward. The mask came off. It was the broker. "Ronald." The broker's voice was smooth and venomous. "I thought you'd be here sooner. But you're a little too late." And from behind him, Charlie's small voice echoed softly, calling out for his father. Ronald's blood turned to ice. This was it. The final game. The broker smiled. "Welcome to the end." The air in the warehouse was thick with tension, each breath feeling heavier than the last. Ronald stood frozen for a moment, his eyes locked on the broker, who stood before him with that cold, calculating smile. The voice behind him, small and fragile, sent a sharp pain through his chest. "Daddy." Charlie's voice trembled from somewhere in the shadows. Ronald's heart shattered. He pushed forward, stepping out from behind the stack of crates, his eyes scanning desperately for his son. The broker's smile widened. "You're too late, Mr. Payne. My men have been watching you for a long time. This was never about money." "Let him go," Ronald shouted, his voice raw with desperation. He took another step forward, his hands balled into fists. The broker didn't flinch. "You should have known better than to cross me. You think your life matters to me? He matters. The little boy you've been protecting so dearly. The same boy you failed to protect from the beginning." The darkness in his voice sent a chill down Ronald's spine. Charlie's whimper broke through the air again, and it was more than Ronald could bear. He clenched his jaw and stepped forward, but the broker raised his hand, signaling his men. Two of the broker's enforcers stepped forward from the shadows, their weapons trained on Ronald. One held a gun to his side, the other a large, menacing baton. "Stay where you are," the man with the gun growled. Ronald's eyes shifted quickly to the shadows, where he could make out the faint outline of Charlie. His son was sitting on the floor, bound to a chair, but his wide, terrified eyes locked onto his father's. Ronald's breath quickened. "Let him go," Ronald repeated, his voice barely a whisper. He took another step forward, his eyes fixed on his son. The broker noticed the movement. "Do you really think you can save him?" The broker's voice was quiet, almost too calm. "What makes you think I'd let you walk out of here alive?" Ronald wasn't listening anymore. His eyes were focused entirely on Charlie. His son's face was pale, tears streaming down his cheeks, and his little body was trembling with fear. "Please, Daddy." Charlie's voice broke Ronald's heart into 1,000 pieces. Ronald took a breath, steadying himself. He wasn't going to let fear rule him. Not now. Not when he had the chance to save his son. "Listen to me, Ronald." The broker's tone became almost friendly, as if trying to reason with him. I don't need you. I don't care about you. But I do care about how much you mean to the people you love. I know you'll do anything for him." He motioned toward Charlie. "But this is bigger than you. It's bigger than your son. It's about control. It's about power." Ronald's eyes flared with rage. His teeth clenched. "You won't get away with this." The broker chuckled, the sound dark and hollow. "I already have." Suddenly, without warning, the air exploded with the sound of gunshots. Ronald flinched, instinctively throwing himself to the ground. The gunfire came from the direction of the entrance. His heart skipped a beat. He looked around wildly, expecting the worst, but it wasn't the enemy that had opened fire. The door had been kicked open. A team of officers rushed into the warehouse, guns drawn, taking cover behind crates and debris. "Everyone on the ground," one of the officers shouted. The broker's men immediately reacted, raising their weapons in return. The sound of a firefight echoed through the warehouse. Ronald's heart skipped. He turned to see Charlie still sitting helplessly on the floor, too young to understand the chaos around him. His legs were bound to the chair, and his eyes were wide with fear, darting from the chaos of the gunfire to his father. "Charlie!" Ronald screamed, his voice breaking as he tried to reach him. But the officers were in the line of fire, and Ronald's path was blocked by a barrage of bullets. The broker sneered and turned to his men. "Don't let him get to the boy," he ordered. In that instant, two of the masked enforcers broke away, moving to intercept Ronald. He scrambled to his feet, but before he could react, one of them slammed into him, knocking him to the ground. The officer closest to Ronald opened fire, hitting the man in the leg. The enforcer dropped with a painful grunt, but the second man lunged at Ronald, grabbing him by the throat. Ronald fought back, his mind focused only on one thing, his son. "Let me go," he yelled, using all his strength to break free. But the enforcer was too strong. Another officer jumped into the fray, tackling the man off Ronald. The officer's partner stepped in to help, and together, they restrained the remaining enforcer, tying him up. But the broker had already vanished into the shadows. Ronald scrambled to his feet, not bothering to check the status of the men. His only focus was Charlie. "Charlie!" Ronald shouted again, pushing past the officers as they engaged in gunfire with the broker's remaining men. He ran toward his son, who was still sitting helplessly in the chair. Ronald reached him, frantic. His heart was in his throat as he knelt beside Charlie, cutting the ropes with his knife. The boy's wide eyes were full of confusion and fear. "Daddy?" Charlie whispered, his voice cracking. "What's happening?" Ronald pulled his son into his arms, holding him tightly. "It's okay, Charlie. You're safe now. I'm here. I'm not going to let anything happen to you." The sounds of gunfire and shouting continued in the background, but Ronald couldn't focus on anything else. His son was alive. That was all that mattered. And in that moment, the broker's plan, his hold over Ronald, had failed. Because no matter what, Ronald would fight to protect his family. But it wasn't over. Not yet. The broker was still out there. And Ronald knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to stop until the broker was taken down, once and for all. The chaos in the warehouse continued to roar around Ronald as he held Charlie tightly against his chest. The boy's small body trembled, but at least he was safe. At least for now. Ronald couldn't hear the gunfire clearly anymore, his world narrowing to the sensation of Charlie's warm, fragile form in his arms. He wanted to hold him forever, to make sure nothing could hurt him again. But there was no time to waste. "Stay down, Charlie," Ronald murmured, his voice soft but urgent. He gently placed his son behind him, positioning himself as a shield. He needed to get Charlie out of here, away from the madness. There was no way he was letting the broker win. No way. The officers were making progress, pushing the broker's men into retreat. Ronald could see that some of the men were already detained, but the situation was still volatile. The sound of gunshots rang out with sporadic intensity, and Ronald could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. One officer ran toward him, breathing hard, eyes scanning the room. "We need to move, now? They'll be back with reinforcements soon." Ronald nodded, his grip tightening around Charlie. "We're not leaving until we get him. Where's the broker?" The officer's face was grim. "He's disappeared, vanished like a ghost. We've tried to find him in the system before, but he's too careful, too smart. But right now, the priority is getting you both to safety." Ronald's thoughts raced. They could run, hide, escape, but the broker would never stop. Not until he had destroyed everything Ronald loved. "Where's the exit?" he asked urgently, his eyes never leaving Charlie. The officer pointed toward a large metal door at the far end of the warehouse. "That way, through the loading docks. It's a secured route." Ronald nodded. He turned back to Charlie. The boy was still holding his teddy bear tightly, but his face had lost the childlike innocence it once had. Fear had carved itself into his expression, and Ronald's heart broke just a little more. "Charlie, listen to me. We're going to get out of here. I'm going to take you somewhere safe," he said, kneeling down so their eyes met. Charlie nodded, his small face full of confusion but trusting his father without question. "Okay, Daddy." The officer led the way, and Ronald moved behind him, keeping close to his son, constantly on alert for any sign of danger. The sound of shuffling footsteps echoed in the distance, but there was no time to stop, no time to rest. They reached the door, and the officer kicked it open. It led to a narrow, dark corridor that led to the loading dock. The sounds of the ongoing firefight were muffled now, distant, as they moved through the back passages of the warehouse. But just as they reached the exit, the ground shook with a deafening explosion. The blast sent them all sprawling forward, tumbling to the cold concrete. Ronald's head hit the ground with a painful thud, and for a moment, everything went black. When Ronald came to, the world was still spinning. He groaned and pushed himself up, his vision blurry. He could hear the muffled sound of Charlie crying in the distance. His heart hammered in his chest as he scrambled to his feet, ignoring the pain in his head. "Charlie," he yelled, panic rising in his throat. His vision cleared, and he saw the officer lying unconscious on the floor. The corridor was strewn with debris from the explosion. But Charlie was gone. The knot in Ronald's chest tightened as he realized what had happened. They hadn't just been attacked, they'd been set up. The broker was ahead of them. He knew they would try to escape. Ronald's breath came in short gasps as he searched the room, his mind frantically replaying the last few moments. Then he saw it. A door ajar, moving slightly in the breeze from the explosion. The sound of footsteps, faint but unmistakable. They were getting away. "No!" Ronald shouted, his voice hoarse as he sprinted toward the door. He reached it in seconds, pushing it open with all his strength. What he saw made his blood run cold. Standing at the end of the hallway, illuminated by the dim, flickering light of a broken bulb, was a shadow. The broker. In his arms, Charlie, tightly bound, eyes wide with fear. "Let him go," Ronald shouted, his voice hoarse from desperation. The broker tilted his head, an amused smile playing at the corners of his lips. "I told you, Ronald. You could have played along. But you chose to be the hero. And now your son pays for it." Ronald's fists clenched, the adrenaline pumping through his veins. He could feel the heat of rage building in him, but his mind was clear. He couldn't lose control. Not now. Not with Charlie's life hanging in the balance. "Please," Ronald said, his voice raw. "Please. I'll do whatever you want. Just let him go." The broker's smile widened. "It's too late for that, Ronald. You've already crossed the line. I've played my hand. And now, I will finish what I started." Ronald could hear the faint click of a gun being cocked behind the broker. He didn't have much time. The broker took one step back, moving away from the entrance, the shadows swallowing him up. "I could let you take him, Ronald. But you're too predictable." The sound of gunfire rang out again, deafening in the close space, and Ronald's body tensed in reflex. He dove forward, but the broker was already gone, disappearing into the darkness with Charlie. "No!" Ronald screamed, but it was too late. The broker had vanished again. The room fell silent, and Ronald's heart shattered. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about something deeper. A game. And the broker had just moved his final piece. The lights flickered as Ronald stood in the wreckage, his breath coming in ragged bursts. His son, Charlie, was gone again. And this time, Ronald had no idea how much time he had left to save him. The broker had pulled the strings, manipulating every move Ronald had made. But now, he would make his final play. One way or another, this was going to end. And Ronald was going to make sure it ended on his terms. The warehouse was silent except for the distant echo of sirens approaching the scene. Ronald stood frozen in the center of the room, his mind numb. His son, Charlie, was gone again, taken by the broker. The broker had toyed with him for months, but now it was real. Charlie's life hung in the balance. There was no more running. There was no more hiding. This was the final confrontation. Ronald's thoughts were a blur, but one thing was clear. He would stop at nothing to get Charlie back. His fists clenched. This ends tonight. Behind him, the remaining officers were regaining their footing. The detective who had been with him during the raid walked up, looking bruised but alive. He had seen many things in his years of service, but nothing like this. Nothing so personal. "Ronald, we're going to get him back," the detective said, his voice steady despite the chaos. Ronald nodded, but said nothing. His mind raced, replaying every single step he had taken to get to this point. The broker had orchestrated everything. He had planned it all out, anticipating Ronald's every move. But Ronald wasn't finished yet. A single phone vibrated in his pocket. The detective looked at him, but Ronald pulled the phone out and looked at the screen. His heart raced as he saw a new message. It was from an unknown number. "You're too late. I have your son. You'll never find him." Ronald gripped the phone so tightly, his knuckles turning white. The broker was taunting him, playing with him. But this time, Ronald would play the game his way. He glanced back at the detective. "Get me everything on the broker. Now." The detective's eyes hardened. "What are you planning?" "I'm going to bring him down. Once and for all." The detective gave him a hard look, but nodded, pulling out his phone to make the calls. Ronald's eyes were locked onto the darkness ahead. This time, there would be no escape for the broker. Hours later, a cold wind blew across the city. The streets were empty, and the only sound was the faint hum of distant traffic. Ronald had spent hours poring over every lead, every scrap of information he had gathered. With the detective's help, they'd traced the broker's operations back to a building at the edge of the city, a large, fortified compound on the outskirts of town. It was time. They arrived under the cover of night. The building loomed ahead like a fortress, guarded by armed men and surrounded by high, razor-wire fences. But Ronald had no fear. This was the final stand. The plan was simple. The detective's team would take the front while Ronald and a small group of officers would infiltrate from the back. They had the element of surprise, and they weren't going to let it slip away. Ronald's heart pounded as they moved silently toward the compound. Every step took them closer to Charlie, and closer to the end. As they breached the compound, an alarm suddenly blared, piercing the silence. The broker had known they were coming. Gunfire erupted from the front. But Ronald didn't hesitate. He moved fast, darting from shadow to shadow, his mind focused on one thing: Charlie. They reached the central building. Ronald's heart raced as he kicked the door open and stormed inside. His breath came in sharp bursts as he scanned the dark hallway. His son was somewhere inside. Then, a voice. "Ronald." It was the broker. His calm, collected tone echoed through the halls. Ronald turned, his pulse racing as the broker stepped out from the shadows, still masked, but his eyes gleaming with malice. "You're too late," the broker said, his voice full of smug satisfaction. "You should have stayed out of this. But now, it's too late for you." Ronald raised his gun, his hand steady. "You've made a mistake." The broker laughed. "Oh, I've made many mistakes. But you'll be the last one." Suddenly, from behind him, a voice called out, Charlie's voice. "Daddy." Ronald's heart surged. Charlie was alive. He was here. Without thinking, Ronald bolted down the hallway, his footsteps pounding against the floor. The broker's eyes flickered with irritation. "Don't think it'll be that easy." A shot rang out. Ronald dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the bullet. He kept moving, faster now, as the sound of Charlie's voice got closer. Then he saw it. Charlie, standing at the far end of the hallway, bound to a chair but alive. His eyes were wide with fear, but he was safe. For now. "Charlie," Ronald shouted, rushing forward. But the broker wasn't finished. He stepped into the doorway, blocking the path. "It's over, Ronald. You can't win. You're just a man who's run out of time." Ronald's eyes burned with fury. "I'm not leaving without my son." With a swift motion, he fired his weapon. The broker staggered back, the bullet grazing his arm. Ronald rushed forward, grabbed Charlie from the chair, and cut the ropes that bound him. "Dad, are we going home?" Charlie asked, his voice trembling. "We're going home, buddy. I promise." The broker snarled, but before he could do anything, more officers swarmed in, overwhelming his remaining men. It was over. Days later, Ronald sat in his apartment, Charlie curled up next to him, playing with his toys. The world felt different now. Quiet. Safe. The broker was gone. The operation had been dismantled. And with every criminal connected to him now behind bars, Ronald could breathe easier. Charlie looked up at him with bright eyes. "Daddy, when do we go to the park?" Ronald smiled. "Soon, buddy. We'll go wherever you want." For the first time in months, there was peace. And as Ronald looked at his son, he knew one thing for sure. He would do whatever it took to keep this peace, to protect the family he had nearly lost. The broker had played his final hand. And in the end, Ronald had won.